there's a common misconception about the civil rights movement that in 1955, Rosa Parks got on a bus after a long day of work. She was tired, and the bus driver asked her to move to the back of the bus, just like Jim Crow segregation said that African Americans were supposed to do, and she said no. And from that moment forward, there was this incredible movement that came up around the South, around the nation, to try to end segregation and end the whole host of oppressions and prejudice and racism that made up the system of Jim Crow. But really nothing could be further from the truth. Some aspect of the civil rights movement, be it a movement against slavery, a movement against lynching, a movement against voting restrictions, really has been a part of American history since the Declaration of Independence. There's never not been a civil rights movement. So why is it that when we talk about the civil rights movement, we're almost always talking about the 1950s and the 1960s? So I think what we're talking about is not necessarily this watershed moment where the civil rights movement came out of nowhere, but rather a watershed moment when the civil rights movement began to win a lot of victories. So why is the civil rights movement victorious in the 1950s and 1960s? And I want to argue that it's got a lot to do with the aftermath of World War II in the United States. So let's talk about some of the interesting and particular aspects of American society that contribute to the success of the civil rights movement in this time period. For one thing, the war itself had a lot of aspects that led Americans to, shall we say, question what we would call scientific racism. And scientific racism was a belief that, for example, the principles of Charles Darwin in evolution applied to humans. Now, we know today that all humans are pretty much exactly alike when it comes to evolution. But in the early 20th century, there was a belief that white people were the most evolved of the races, and then each other race in the world was on a scale from most civilized to least civilized. But when the United States went to war against Hitler in World War II, who was directly promoting this idea of racial superiority, the idea that one group of people was better than the other really started to go out of style in the United States. So it really leads people to think again about these artificial divisions between the races and artificial classifications between the races that shine a light on similar practices within the United States. So racial segregation and racial hatred begin to, in some ways, seem un-American. Another important aspect of American society that leads to successes in the civil rights movement is the proliferation of news media. Right? The first televisions start to come into American homes in the late 1940s, and by the mid-1950s, a pretty sizable proportion of the United States has a television. So a lot of things that might have been brushed under the rug before media existed to shine a light on it suddenly were out there in the open. So we have TV, newspapers, radio. And of these, of course, I would say that television is the most important one because it really brings to life the kinds of racial abuses that are shown on the evening news and really dramatize what it's like to live as a Black person in the South, whereas a newspaper article might not necessarily really bring that to life. Another important aspect of the post-war era that leads to civil rights movement success is the Cold War itself. So the United States is in an ideological struggle with the Soviet Union between the capitalist economic system of the United States and the communist economic system of the Soviet Union. And there's really a question between the two of them of which has the better society. And you see this in a lot of different ways. For example, there's a famous debate called the kitchen debate, where each nation showed what the average kitchen in the United States versus the average kitchen in the Soviet Union looked like. And it was widely agreed that the United States won because there were so many cool labor-saving devices like dishwashers and ovens that really showed that the standard of living in the United States was better than the standard of living in the Soviet Union. But the existence of racial segregation and abuses of African Americans, which were broadcast on television and, of course, shared around the world, really made the United States look bad when it comes to which society actually has the better standard of living for a whole range of different peoples. So it provided very good ammunition for the Soviet Union to say, well, the United States says that they're a society that is democratic and equal, but look what they do to a portion of their population. So Jim Crow segregation was really a blight on the United States' image abroad, and I think that provided a lot of impetus for politicians to take a stand against laws which, for example, limited the voting rights of African Americans in the South. Similarly, during World War II, many African American soldiers had served in the various armed forces of the United States, the Navy, the Army, eventually the Marines. And a lot of the experiences that they had while serving as soldiers were really important drivers for their involvement in the civil rights movement upon their return to the United States. For example, Medgar Evers is an important figure in the civil rights movement who helped to liberate France during World War II, and he saw so much of the American propaganda during World War II saying, we have democracy, there's nothing more important than the right to vote. So when he got home to Mississippi in 1946, he got a bunch of his friends who were also veterans together, and they went down to the courthouse to try to vote. And they were turned away by a mob of white men with guns. So a lot of the veterans not only experienced racism while in the armed services. For example, the Army had segregation. There were segregated units between blacks and whites. And even the Red Cross separated white blood and black blood for transfusions. So you can see how that scientific racism was part and parcel of American beliefs when World War II started. And by the end of World War II, when the horrors of the Holocaust had really come to light, that kind of scientific racism of separating the blood of the races really began to cast the United States practices in a bad light. But if I had to choose one thing to explain why the civil rights movement became so big in the 1950s and 60s and why it had so many successes, I would really have to say it had to do with the affluence of the post-war era. Now, we've mentioned before that the United States is really the only country in the world that comes out of World War II with its industrial system intact. And after World War II, the United States rapidly becomes the richest country in the world, and the standard of living for almost everyone goes up considerably. This is why we have the baby boom, for example, and the expansion of suburbs. And much of this new wealth was the result of perks given to soldiers in the GI Bill, which gave soldiers free college tuition, subsidied loans, all sorts of things that helped them improve their financial standing in the world. The problem with this, of course, was that many African Americans couldn't get access to the kinds of perks that white soldiers and veterans could get from the GI Bill. For example, college tuition was not worth a whole lot if, for example, the school that you wanted to go to was segregated and didn't admit black students in the first place. Or having a home loan guarantee wasn't worth a whole lot if the neighborhood you were trying to move into had a restrictive covenant that said that no one could sell their house to a black person. So as white veterans and their families begin to take advantage of all of the aspects of the GI Bill that leads them to having a better life in the 1950s, most African Americans just can't take advantage of those things. And it puts the inherent racism of that system on stark display. So as your average white family got wealthier and wealthier, those kinds of benefits were just not accruing for Black families. It was really clear that white families were able to make a whole lot more progress in attaining middle-class status than Black families were.